so much for that amazing introduction, Dr. Dule, and I appreciate the work you've done to put this conference together. And it's really, really amazing and right on time when we kind of start to recognize the power that we have to really shift the the global arena with regard to trade and investment and business on the continent. And so, yes, as an Ethiopian American who has been invested in the continent's welfare for its people, and also as a trained political scientist, I always appreciate these spaces to learn from colleagues like yourself and those who've been speaking at this conference. Who bring a business and economic lens to some serious opportunities to change the game in Africa. That being said, I also appreciate the space as a political scientist to talk about the ways in which, whether you're talking about trade relations in my case or economic growth more broadly, it is married to political stability. And so when we talk about leverage politics and the ability to influence policy and policymakers to advance economic growth on the continent, we cannot dismiss the importance of political stability and the factors that help shape sustainable economic growth. So I've been asked today to talk about leverage strategy when it comes to policy influence and international trade relations. And of course, as I mentioned, given my background, I come to the issues of economic growth and investment through the understanding of policy and political influencers that either hinder, promote, or help keep static environments that are conducive for trade relations with Africa in this case. So given that, and we're all, at least those of us who are paying attention to the US elections, leverage policy is a big thing in our field. And given that we're in the midst of another historic US presidential election where the power and influence of people like Stacey Abrams to potentially flip Georgia blue really actually provides a real-time example of us to think about leverage politics and how what's happening right now in the state of Georgia in the United States is also analogous to how we might better understand leverage in the context of trade relations. First of all, in my field, when I thought about this topic that Dr. Remy and I kind of discussed, I thought about leverage theory, which in political science was a theory and concept introduced by Dr. Ron Walters, who actually was a political scientist who created the blueprint for the Congressional Black Caucus. And he wrote a book called Black Presidential Politics in America, where he talks about the ability of Black people to use the electoral system differently from other groups to achieve their social, political, and economic goals. And also discuss how leverage politics was both a dependent leverage, so behind the scenes bargaining, but also how it could be used as independent leverage, and in the case of politics, directly electing people like Charles Rangel, for instance, who was the godfather of AGOA, and how for the Black body politic, these were vehicles of influencing politics through group leverage theory, which is in many ways a great lens to look at the continent with regard to leverage politics in the international trades arena. So my point here is that leverage politics in the global trade arena allows us to better understand the power and influence of entities like ECOWAS, FOCAC, the sort of Forum of China and Africa Cooperation, or policy initiatives like AGOA and Power Africa, and of course, more recently, the Africa Union brokering what will be the largest free trade area and agreement in the world with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which, as you all know, will connect 1.3 billion people across 55 countries with a combined GDP valued at almost $3.4 trillion. And the World Bank has estimated that by 2035, this free trade agreement has the potential to lift 30 million people out of extreme poverty, increase total exports by almost 30%, increase intercontinental exports by more than 81%, while also increasing exports to non-African countries by almost 20%, and suggests African countries are beginning to really harness their collective leverage in ways that will revolutionize trade relations with Africa. And I see this happening in two major ways. One, through drastically shifting the playing field, where the continent will have significant bargaining power to set the terms of trade agreements for generations to come. And then two, Africa will have the potential to significantly benefit millions of people on its road to self-sufficiency and economic sustainability. For those of us who are watching, the ability of nations to achieve the SDG goals, and not just around, economic growth and infrastructure, but also in other, equally important goals like reducing poverty and closing the gender wage gap and increasing job opportunities. This Continental African Trade Agreement has the ability to revolutionize the lives of African people. And so this is definitely a major shift in the global trade arena, and it demonstrates the power of not only leverage, but also group think, group strategy, and the influence of political institutions and policymakers to provide new pathways for economic sustainability. And so for those of us who know the influence of AGOA and the story behind the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which was not passed that long ago, 20 years ago, it was a defining moment for the US in its recognition of Africa as a robust trading partner. But we must not forget that this seminal legislation was spearheaded by a Congressional Black Caucus member, a co-founder of the Congressional Black Caucus, who literally operated in groupthink mentality, right? Even the passage of AGOA, if you actually dig down to the politics of why now, who was behind it, you see that a group leverage theory played a role in even bringing US up to par with China and others to take Africa more seriously with the passage of that act. And so we have to give credit to where it's due, but more importantly, also analyze the factors that account for countries stepping up to recognize the trade potential of the African continent, right? Which, people kind of lump in one big plot of land, but we're talking about, over 50 countries, right? This is major. And so it is not happenstance that the US's big and bold attempts to improve its trade and investments with Africa have been shaped by like-minded groups of policymakers with an understanding of not just how to use their power to advance policy, but also to advance Black people, African people, and people of African descent. And this brings me to my next point about why political context will forever be tied to the ability of nations to sustain economic growth and trade or not. And many of you know this, oftentimes when we have these kinds of conversations, the economists and business folks are in one room and the political scientists and the humanitarians are in the other room. And this is again why I appreciate being invited to this space, because I believe that all of us have the collective power of us to think about trade and investment in ways that benefit the masses through a socially conscious mentality will have invaluable advantages to the continent and to trade partners on both sides of the stick. So sustainable leverage occurs when economic and political stability are in sync. And so the realities of the US and China's engagement with Africa today, which to many appear to be a reawakening, but to any historian would be a logical outcome of a continent playing catch up from colonization, with regard to also its partners playing catch up with realizing that many of them actually had a hand in not necessarily helping Africa advance in ways that would benefit them economically. And so this catch-up phase we're in really comes out of a historical awareness of the ways in which I would say colonization on the African continent and even slavery in the United States, for instance, have put us further back than we would have otherwise been. That being said, we also understand that we've made tremendous progress, but this realization awakening phase to look at Africa beyond, right? If you all recall when the Council of Foreign Relations wrote the report, I believe it was 2015, on more than a humanitarian approach, a strategic lens to look at the continent of Africa. Great initiative, right? But why is it happening in the 21st century, right? Why did we not look at the continent and its trade potential, you know, decades ago, right? And it's because of the history of colonization and race, and so that plays a role. Why, you know, so it's, I just want to make sure that as we revel in these newfound opportunities of trade and economic growth, that we also cannot celebrate them without an analytical eye to who the real beneficiaries are, whose leverage actually makes a difference and why, and to what extent economic growth can sustain blowbacks like political instability, the aftermath of colonization, ethnic or religious turmoil, maternal mortality, famine, poverty, and disease. And how do we make sure that we measure economic growth for the masses and not just the few? And far too often we don't center in what way trade relations and business enterprises can and should be vehicles for social enterprises to further meet the goals of groups like ECOWAS and AU and the African Continent Free Trade Agreement. And we know that many of Africa's trade partners are recognizing that they will need to work with and through multilateral partnerships that will continue to have enormous leverage, not only in Africa, but also with their foreign partners and policymakers. So as we kind of think about the potential for a free trade agreement between US and Kenya, we should also recognize that actually Africa's looking at its group potential that has way more influence, right, and collective bargaining power, if you will, than some of these bilateral agreements. Not to say that's not a good thing, but I'm trying to raise the symbolic and substantive importance of these institutions that were really homegrown in Africa that often get overlooked in mainstream discussions around economic growth and trade. And so finally, when we talk about, well, I should also say this, you know, when we think about the African Free Trade Continental Agreement, I mean, who was behind it? The Africa Union. And so one question would be is, why does the Africa Union exist in the first place? And would an African Continental Free Trade Agreement have been possible without it? So I have read numerous articles about how this is going to be revolutionary for the continent. And there, in my estimation, is no other group of people that would be able to pull together 55 nations to drastically reduce trade barriers, operate as a collective whole, advance GDP beyond something we've ever seen before. But it was brokered by the Africa Union. And the Africa Union's establishment was also based on the history of a series of nations that were stripping itself from colonization, that ripped them of early potential and economic opportunity to be self-sufficient and to be a superpower, group of superpowers leading trade throughout the world. And so I just want to lift that up, that, you know, the Africa Union has a whole history we all know here. And that actually brings me to, you know, my final kind of point here about sort of leverage theory, as it will, as we see it. And that's with regard to the African diaspora, again, which the AU has recognized the sixth region of the AU as those of us all around the world who identify as a member of people of African descent. And so we take that very seriously when it comes to understanding the role that entities like the AU play, but also the role that we play as diaspora Africans around the world, that many who will be brokering some of these, or at least have the influence to play a significant role in the types of trade relationships that Africa will have in the next 50 years. And so we must, you know, recognize the enormous potential and influence of the African diaspora, not only facilitating business, investment, partnerships, and trade in socially responsible ways, but playing a lead role in directing and prioritizing the most profitable and mutually trade beneficial relationships with the potential to transform economic opportunity for the masses. And I can't emphasize enough that I always think about the role that, and almost in some ways, the invisibility or of the African diaspora that are often hidden in plain sight that get this. You know, many of us understand from both an economic business sort of perspective, but also in terms of being socially responsible entrepreneurs, the importance of the kinds of investment and trade partnerships that we forge for a better Africa that helps the masses and not the few. And I have learned tremendous insight from the ways in which trade and investment are discussed on the Africa continent. Who is in the room? Is it just about products and services? How do we measure economic growth and trade? Is it by the number of trade? Is it by the degree to which a GDP is increasing, or is it measured by the degree to which unemployment has dropped? Is it measured by the number of multinational partnerships, or is it measured by reducing the gender wage gap? Is it measured by only looking at one sector of the industry, or having a multilateral lens that looks at a series of socioeconomic indicators, so that these trade partnerships have lasting consequences for positive, sustainable development, while also benefiting, both parties on the receiving end of trade. So, in a nutshell, for me, when we think about leverage, the ability of policy and policymakers to influence the global trade arena, we have to understand the power of groupthink and group strategy, and the power for that Africans understand that and have been using these models to make continued change. We have to understand that political stability is married to long-term economic growth. And so we have to have those conversations to recognize that who's in power and to what degree everybody has equitable access to benefit from trade does matter. And then, of course, the third, element of the African diaspora in playing dual roles in many ways, in not just protecting and safeguarding, but really forwarding a comprehensive vision of what Africa trade and development could look like for the people. Because at the end of the day, if you got capital, you got choices, right? You can decide where you want to invest and what you want to invest in, and that's a great and beautiful thing. But it can also be an individual endeavor that doesn't require you to think about more than yourself. And the power of the African diaspora is that we come from a place that's rooted in groupthink. Whether you are African American, like Charles Rangel, who started the CBC and then used his position to work with CBC members to even pass AGOA that has brought US to the place where it's now seeing the potential for growth. Or if you are the children of African immigrants like myself, who understand the leverage power I have in negotiating, whether it's with US foreign policy or really in venues like this to talk about our role in not just leading from behind, but leading from the front in determining what kind of investment and diversifying investment and trade in ways that benefit the masses. So I will stop there, but thank you for the platform to allow political scientists like me to talk with all of you smart people in the business economic space. So thank you.